My name is Peter Asmus. I'm the Director of Strategic Marketing at AutoGrid, a Silicon Valley-based company that's been part of the new energy landscape using digital platforms to optimize distributed energy resources, which we're going to be talking in depth today. This is the first episode in a series of podcasts. And today we'll be talking with John Bonnin, who some of you may be familiar with. He's been writing some blogs on the AutoGrid website for quite some time, and he's going to introduce himself in a second. But the reason we're here today is that John recently published a white paper with AutoGrid called Unlocking New Value Streams with Multi-Asset Virtual Power Plants. And so, John, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll carry on with the conversation.
Hey, thank you so much, Peter. And I'm just really thrilled to be part of this podcast today. And I look forward to a great conversation. I've been in the energy industry for over 32 years, both working with investor-owned and municipal utilities. I've worked in environmental department. I've worked in plant operations at a big coal-fired power plant. I've worked in resource planning. I was a power trader for many, many years. And I've worked in executive management, leading, the entire scheduling and operations group, fuels procurement, risk management, computer systems, and all of that. So a long career, retired about 3 years ago, and I've been helping AutoGrid in their, for the last 3 years, in their ambition to harness the tremendous amount of capacity available on the customer side of the electricity equation. For the entire lifetime of our electric grid, it's been all about power plants making power, customers consuming power. But because of changes in technology and the evolution of our grid, our customers are actually producers now. And so the regulatory and technical environment has to catch up with that, so that the customers can actually contribute to meeting the balance of supply and demand on a daily basis. And so AutoGrid specialty is organizing and connecting all of these customer resources, usually on the distribution system, into a coherent strategy and product that can be offered into the market. And so this has a lot of aspects to it, and I think we'll get into a bunch of those today.
Yeah, we're going to kind of step through in some ways, because there's a lot of these buzzwords are being thrown out there. And just one quick addition to your opening there is, in my last job, I was a research analyst, company Navigant Guidehouse. And I remember a few years ago, they came out with a forecast that showed more DER capacity, distributed energy resources, coming online globally than centralized generation. And I remember, when those numbers first came out, a lot of people were like, that's impossible or whatever, they were skeptical. And of course they were not my forecast, so I had to dig in a little deeper. But I think the point is that that's what the future is, that more and more of our electricity resources are coming from these small bits in people's homes and businesses. And these resources are really varied, which we're going to talk about. We tend to think of supply side, as you were describing the old traditional model, but it's not just supply side, it's demand side, it's storage, it's electric vehicles, etc. So it's pretty exciting. It sounds like it could be chaos, and that's why we need things like virtual power plants, digital platforms to make it all work. So, but before we get too far into it, maybe just talk about two categories you focus a lot in this white paper. One, DR, demand response, and the other, distributed energy resources. So how do you distinguish between these two in your white paper, John?
Sure. Demand response has been part of our electric grid for decades. I mean, the ability for a power company to call on like a big industrial station to reduce the amount of power it's using has been standard in the kind of playbook of the traditional utility. I mean, since the 70s and 80s, a company would get a rate that's maybe has a 5% discount from the normal rate, and they would enjoy that lower rate month by month, year by year, just for the option for the power company to come and curtail their power during times that maybe there's a reliability crisis. Maybe there's it's a peak of the summer and there's a power is short, and so that company is agreed to reduce its power use. So that's demand response. Another thing that's been used by utility companies in the area of demand response is controlling customers' air conditioner compressors on peak days. By distributing which compressors run over the period of the peak, you can kind of mitigate those spikes on really high demand days. And they've worked with commercial customers, and this has been sort of in the playbook, like I said, for many years, and it's effective, and it still is effective now. So where do we get distributed energy resources? Well, that's kind of come about more in like the last 20 years or so. It started with big companies co-generating. So you'd have a big refinery and they would build a power plant there. They would use process steam. They would use some of the power for their process and their electrical needs at the refinery or at the factory. But when they had additional power, it would be sold back into the grid. Okay, so that was an early form. Another form was when companies started putting small solar installations in their service area attached to the distribution lines. That's a distributed energy resource. And then finally, when customers started to put on-site storage and backup generation behind the meter, that's also distributed energy resource. And now we have hundreds of thousands of residential customers putting in battery backup and controllable backup generators and electric vehicle chargers and things like this. So demand response is strictly a movement by a customer to use less power in times of emergencies. DER can be a lot of different things. It's just like a lot of little power plants that could be used in any situation.
Yeah, no, I remember like 30 years ago when I first learned about interruptible rates for like industrial customers. I was actually doing some work for an environmental group, and they were actually kind of critical of those programs because they were going, why should the biggest users get a special lower rate compared to the resident? It was kind of this argument because back then a lot of those interruptible rate programs weren't used that often. Like it was kind of like a hedge. But of course, what's changed over the last 30 years is power outages have just multiplied. Whether it's hurricanes, snowstorms in Texas, wildfires in California, and so I think all those programs now are much more valuable. Of course, but what AutoGrid does is like those old DR programs was literally, I think better, like a phone call or someone go, hey, tomorrow it looks like, we're going to have a heat wave. So could you shut down between 1 and 3? I think what's different now with demand response and what your paper's talking about, that literally, there's a signal sent and, depending on the type of product or service, it could respond within a few seconds. So that's, I guess, what's changed about demand response, and AutoGrid and other companies like AutoGrid are sort of now have those technologies which weren't available about 30 years ago. I mean,
That's exactly right.
yeah,
The interruptible rates were initiated just by a phone call, exactly like I said,
right.
or the power company would remotely open your breaker, basically trigger a relay that would just shut off power with no notice, and that's very disruptive, for a refinery or something like that. But yes, as our grid has gotten more sophisticated, we've gotten more demands on the grid. I think grids are playing it a lot closer to the ragged edge as far as reserve margin is concerned. You have a lot more opportunities for problems to happen. So we have to use our best card in our hand, which is technology and innovation, to sort of address that. And AutoGrid is right in the middle of that.
Yeah. Now, one theme you touched upon in your white paper is sort of moving from a defensive strategy, and of course, some of us just saw the Super Bowl, versus an offensive strategy with DR and DER. So maybe you could just describe a little bit like why was it defensive in the past and why is it offensive now
Great.
today?
Yeah, that's kind of my way of thinking about it. So in the past, utility companies used interruptible rates to defend against blackouts. Okay, we're about to go into a blackout situation unless we cut off all these interruptible rates. So that's defense, right?
Hmm.
Or a utility company may call on demand response because they are getting to their annual peak. And in a lot of markets, every individual utility company pays its low ratio share for the operation of the grid, right? And so your load ratio share is calculated on how much load you have on the very peak day. And so if you can sort of modulate how much you're using on the very peak day, you can save in all of those fees that are calculated by low, you lower your load ratio share compared to other companies. That saves money, right? And then finally, companies themselves were on a rate that had a demand component and an energy component. So your energy component was how many kilowatt hours you got, and you paid so many cents per kilowatt hour. But you would also pay a fee every month based on your highest demand of the year. And if you can knock down that highest demand of the year by a little bit, then that shows up as a smaller bill for the whole rest of the year. So as I'm saying, defensive, people deployed demand response and some DERs in the past for cost savings. So let's move to the future. Because of moves by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to enable distribution connected assets to be actually able to sell power in the wholesale market, it enables a lot of these companies to go from using these assets just to for cost savings to actually revenue generating. That's what I mean by offense. Let's put this capacity into the market and sell it when those prices get high. And so I think that is providing a lot of incentives for innovation and companies to try to how do we tease this out? How do we connect it? How do we bid it into the market and operate it such that we can extract that value from the market? So that's why I kind of go say that it's going from defense to offense.
No, I like that. I like that. And so one thing I think before we go further is, the white paper talks about multi-asset virtual power plants, but I guess we should also define a virtual power plant. You've talked about the DERs. Um, I actually came up with a definition a while ago. I just found, which is basically what's a VPP, an aggregated system of energy assets remotely and automatically optimized by a software-based platform to dispatch services for distribution or wholesale markets. The key is really wholesale markets. And as you mentioned, FERC Order 2222 is really trying to say, let's make that kind of happen all across the country. I think, so far we have these different, well, we have many, and we'll talk about Texas and its kind of unique situation, but we have these control areas, but some parts of the country don't have independent system operators. Some of it is still sort of run by utilities. But I actually looked up into Wikipedia where they quoted me about virtual power plants. I was going to read that on the air here, just to pound my chest. No, I'm just kidding. It says, they quote me from a report back in 2012. So, wow, that's 10 years ago. Geez, I guess I'm getting old. Virtual power plants represent an internet of energy. These systems tap existing grid networks to tailor electricity supply and demand services for customers. VPPs maximize value for both the end user and the distribution utility using a sophisticated set of software-based systems. They are dynamic, deliver value in real time, and can react quickly to changing customer load conditions. So that's something I said a long time ago. But if you want to maybe reflect on that a little bit about VPPs, and maybe let's get into the white paper, because what's great about your white paper is you really kind of lay out the step-by-step approach. Like, well, how do you really make this happen? Sounds great. Those are nice words. Yeah, wow, that sounds good. But how do you
Sure.
make that reality? And that's why you're here, John. You're
Yeah,
telling us
sure.
how to
So
make it real.
yeah, I really like that definition about VPPs. It's a heterogeneous set of capabilities.
Right.
Okay, so it's assets, but it's also capabilities. If you think about like a hotel that has the ability to, or a school district that has ability to shut off lights, that's not an asset as much as it's a capability.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. So that is definitely distributed energy resource, even though it's not a particular asset like a battery would be or a generator, something like that. So
Right.
they're heterogeneous because they all have different attributes and different operational parameters. Some last a long time, some don't last very long. Some have a quick response time, some are longer. So it's a very difficult and mismatched group of capabilities, like we said. But uh, companies like AutoGrid have been breaking this down and figuring out how to make them all work together. So, so the white paper that I wrote just basically addressed. Let's say you're a utility and you have a lot of these different things in your utility, and you want to organize it and you want to offer it into market to sell it. Um, what are some of those capabilities? Okay, we went through sort of a laundry list before, but I'll do it again. Let's say you have 100,000 customers, all of whom have smart thermostats that you can have access to. And you can go in and click that thermostat up 3 degrees if you need to in the hot part of the summer. Then instantly you'll have 100,000 compressors that shut off. Now that's a tremendous amount of energy. Each compressor is about 2 kW. So if you have 100,000 of those, that's a couple of megawatts. That's several megawatts of capacity. Okay, that's one. Let's say you have 10,000 customers, each of which has an 8 kilowatt hour battery in their home. Okay, now that's a different thing that you could utilize in the market for different purposes. Let's say you have a bunch of commercial customers, hotel chains, grocery stores that can reduce their power load, with a 15-minute notice. That's a capability that you could use. Let's say you have car chargers that, if necessary, you can send a signal to stop that charger from charging a car or a bus or a forklift or whatever, and then all of a sudden that energy is available for the grid. So these are all different technologies out there that all have to be addressed individually, what they can do, how long they can do it, and plus the whole electric control interface between here and there. This is kind of what a virtual power plant, that's the kind of nuts and bolts of how a virtual power plant has to be strung together. In comparison, I've worked at big, huge nuclear plants and coal-fired power plants. Are immensely complex structures, but in its own way, a VPP is just as complex. So,
Yeah.
um,
Uh, Even more so in some ways, you might say.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because of the sheer number of interfaces. So, how does all this work with the grid? Well, the grid only wants to talk to one counterparty, right? They just want to talk to just that power plant or just that wind farm or just that solar farm. So what the virtual power plant is basically an aggregator of all of those sub assets. So they have to figure out a way to connect them all up to one single point of control, because the grid isn't interested in, I want you to deploy 8,000 Tesla power walls or 4,800 air compressors, or at different customers. They're not interested in that. They just want you as a VPP to give me 25 megawatts. That's all I want. How you do it is up to you. Okay. So, so if you think about that, the virtual power plant has to be able to take those kinds of signals, figure out how to optimize all the assets at their disposal to give you the 25 megawatts. And that's quite a trick. And but we figured out how to do that, and it's becoming more and more a part of different portfolios around the country and around the world.
Yeah. No, I think one just sort of more of a historical note is when you talk about virtual power plants in the US, it really started with demand response, as you were kind of saying before. Like that was kind of the first concept of the virtual power plant. Like, well, there's a summer peak day, we could fire up our fossil fuel peaker. That's why they're there. They don't use them that often, but they are expensive. They also tend to be fairly dirty from an emissions viewpoint. So that's kind of started in the US. In Europe, though, when you look at the literature about VPPs, it started more with variable renewables and the idea like, well, if we have solar and wind, but we had some biomass and some hydro, there was a project in Germany, I think they called it the combined power plant, but basically the same term. And they said, well, theoretically, if we operated all these things, when the wind wasn't blowing and the sun wasn't shining, you'd have the biomass or the hydro, and then, you could put that all together. So I would call that more like a supply side VPP. But now the whole market and is moving towards this idea, and you've already touched on this. It doesn't matter if it's demand, supply, storage, EVs, water heaters, pool, uh, pool pumps,
Yeah.
heat pumps. As long as you can sense it and touch it, and this is where the artificial intelligence also comes in, and that's another buzzword out there. But that's where the software will learn the performance of actually, I guess, manufacture certain kinds of water heaters manufactured by certain people. Maybe they have a slightly different characteristic or response as opposed to another one. And that's the sophistication of these systems. It sounds kind of like, wow, how can that really work? But it's working today in multiple markets around the world. It's pretty amazing.
Right. I should add just a little bit more to our discussion of distributed energy resources how they work in the market.
Sure.
So we mentioned earlier that there are larger assets like big backup generators at refineries and factories. There's also distribution connected solar and even storage now. And of course, there are companies that have large motors, machines, compressors, but that they can shut off when needed to provide what's called load response. Now, those larger assets with their larger capability usually have their own programs that they can participate with directly with the grid. For instance, the ERCOT grid offers something called load response. And one example is like if you have a big air separation plant, like an Air Products or Linde company that uses these gigantic compressors to compress air, cool it down, and liquefy it, so you can make liquid nitrogen, liquid oxygen, hydrogen, and whatnot. Those are gigantic electric uh, uh, electric energy users. These big motors, right? And so, but they can shut them down anytime you want. And if you can shut down a 9 megawatt motor in 10 minutes, that's the same thing as ramping up a 9 megawatt power plant in 10 minutes. And so frequently those will have like their own program that they can participate in with the grid, and they can get paid separately on that. Now, what's important is who controls that capability. Sometimes the local utility will, but a virtual power plant can also control those kinds of capabilities beyond the small scale things that are behind the meter at residential and commercial. They can also control larger assets like a solar farm or like a distribution storage or like a large load response capabilities like I described. So VPP is not, granted, an aggregated distributed energy resource entity that is all composed of residential customer batteries is a virtual power plant, but a VPP can be so much more. It can control other capabilities, it can control distribution controlled assets, and and optimize all of that for the customer. So I just wanted to make that one point, that we're not just limited to small things behind the meter.
No, no, that's true, and it's a good point. And I've noticed actually at AutoGrid and other vendors, there is now actually a focus more on front of the meter assets. In fact, we have another blog coming out on the AutoGrid website talking more about older front of the meter batteries
Mhm.
and how they're being upgraded to kind of do more sophisticated things than they originally were intended to do. And that's kind of an issue because there were batteries installed 10 years ago. They don't necessarily maybe have all of the bells and whistles that a new battery. But yes, VPPs can incorporate wind farms, solar farms, so it's not just behind the meter. I mean, I think that's where the focus has been because that's kind of the newer strategy and stuff like that. But, your paper does talk. Oh, go
Headlines,
ahead.
and Texas has grabbed a lot of headlines with its distributed energy resource task force, aggregated distributed energy resource task force, ADER. I'm actually on that committee. I've been helping with putting some of the protocols together for how that can operate in the ERCOT market. And this spring, they're doing a pilot, of companies who can deploy behind the meter small assets in response to a signal from the market. But it's also being done in California and a lot of other places, Australia,
Right.
other markets around the world.
Yes, and Europe too is kind of a hotspot for VPPs because they've got all those countries, but all those markets are pretty integrated. Although there's some transmission constraints, and Spain is kind of off to the side, but Europe is also a lot of sophisticated VPPs that even span countries, not just a single country market. So, that's what we're seeing a lot of. So, but you mentioned, so we're talking about some that the VPPs can have larger assets as well. Now, you just mentioned ERCOT, and you've been involved with utilities in ERCOT. I don't want to put you on the spot, but like, different regions of the U.S. and VPPs. I'm just curious, maybe talk a little bit about ERCOT. And I mentioned it's a little unique. So we mentioned FERC Order 222, which is trying to kind of almost create a level playing field of, I think assets small as 100 kilowatts of aggregated. I believe that's the threshold that, theoretically, even just 100 kilowatts of something could be some solar, could be a mixture, could sell in a wholesale market. But ERCOT has purposely avoided being part of FERC. Maybe just give us a very short history lesson. But ERCOT is still a pioneer in one of the hottest VPP markets. So how did that happen? But you're in Texas. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. We'll take story time here about Texas independence, right? So
Yes.
It's a big state, and its grid sort of naturally evolved, through the 1900s. But when the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was set up, it deals with interstate commerce, and at the time, ERCOT, the interconnection that would eventually become ERCOT, the state made a decision to keep it inside the state to keep it from being subject to regulation by the feds. And so they have its own regulatory body under the PUC in the state of Texas. Now, that's got good things, right? We're all locally controlled. That's a big thing in Texas.
Oh, yeah.
They can make changes quickly. They can integrate new ideas quickly. They can learn from them. They can throw out things quickly. It's all locally controlled. That's a good thing. On the bad side is you can't import power into Texas, into the ERCOT grid from any place else. Now, the ERCOT grid, I must say, is not all of Texas. It's about 80% of the load. It's about 75% of the land area. So El Paso, for instance, is part of the Western grid, and parts of East Texas are part of MISO. All right, and part of the Panhandle is into that grid as well. So the ERCOT grid is not electrically connected to the rest of the grid. So we can't import power. There's a few little DC ties, but it's only like 300 megawatts. And ERCOT's an 80 gigawatt load, right? So it's effectively an island. So it's good from the point of view that you can do regulations and you can kind of regulate it a lot more cleanly without having to have the feds involved. But it's bad when you get to, February 2021 and you're out of power and you just can't bring any power from anywhere else. So they're working on that. So everything has its good and bad points. Yeah. That's kind of the reason why it's separate like that. And so it's using that flexibility to try to try out this ADER task pilot that's happening this fall, because it only has to, a few decisions have to be made in PUC and ERCOT, bam, the thing's happening. Right. Other states, you may have to go and get, other boards approving it or even FERC approving things like this, which just adds time. Now, I must say California's been way ahead of the curve as well. They've seen the need for innovation in the electric energy space, and there has been just a whole number of incentives and other programs in California to enable the rapid adoption of, customer involvement. I mean, retail customer involvement in the wholesale market. So they're doing really well. But others, like you said, they may not have as organized a grid or as a high demand for this sort of service. So they've been kind of lagging. But in FERC Order 2222 actually directs all the different independent grids to create the rules and protocols for making this happen. And so, different states are moving at different rates.
Right. Now, I've heard some people in here, I don't want to necessarily, pit California versus Texas. That goes on all the time. But anyways, then there's PJM, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, which is what it's called, even though it's much broader than that. And I don't know the history of why it was called that. Maybe you do. But, I've heard some people argue that they think that's the most dynamic market for VPPs. They do a lot on demand response. So I guess the issue is each of these regions has sort of a nuance to it. Like you're saying, Texas, independent. I've heard some people say California is great on the incentive side, not as good on the integration of DERs into wholesale markets, but but the trends are positive, PJM. But that's where your white paper also kind of goes through a more of a, I wouldn't call it generic, but more like, well, here's all the steps to create these multi-asset VPPs. And I don't know, maybe you want to get back to that a little bit deeper about kind of a, I don't know how far detail you want to go, but like
Hey,
there's certain steps that are kind of common. Now they all might be shaped, or maybe certain aspects of it will be highlighted more just because of the way the regulations are today. I will, so, but why don't you go through that? I mean, I'd say before you go that, the good news is the trends are generally in a positive direction. Like FERC Order 222 is sort of like the poster child of this. Like things are moving in a direction that only these opportunities will grow in value and revenue opportunities. That's the
totally
good
agree.
news.
Totally
Yeah,
agree.
yeah.
And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about, let's say you're a utility company and you have all these capabilities and you want to get it work together as a VPP and you're going to run it as a utility, right? So how do you go about doing that? Well, first of all, you got to find out what capabilities you have, and you got to you have some thermostat programs because you can integrate with Nest and all these other different smart thermostats. So you'll have that. You've got a whole bunch of, let's say you have a part of your service territory has a tourist destination. You're going to have a bunch of hotels. You got school districts everywhere. Maybe you have an industrial area that has refinery or factories or things like that. And you have a lot of customers that have been investing in solar and electric vehicles. So you have to look at every different capability as a different, kind of call it a different program. And you have to analyze each one of those and find where does it have value in the wholesale market. So for instance, a thermostat program, which is the simplest. You have the ability to send out a signal. People it clicks up the thermostat by 3 degrees, and a bunch of compressors shut off. Now, on a hot day, in just a half an hour or so, that house is going to heat up that 3 degrees, and that compressor is going to kick back on again. So you can click on that particular program. You have 30 minutes of power, and you have however many watts, proportional to the number of customers. So you basically have a peaker that can produce power for 30 minutes. Okay, so that's one inventory. What can it sell? Well, it can sell energy in the market. Energy is just pure megawatts. So if you're not consuming 20 megawatts for 30 minutes, that's the same thing as generating 20 megawatts for 30 minutes. So now, okay, my thermostat program is an energy product and it lasts for 30 minutes. Good, write that down. Next thing you have lighting programs at different industrial. You can figure out how much that changes load whenever they're deployed. Most lighting are a little bit more effective at night than during the day, but you will have something there, and you know that that load is not going to come back once you turn the lights off. They're off until they come back on again. It's not like a compressor that is going to come back on when the house heats up. So that's worth so many megawatts. But you also may have, like I said, 10,000 customers who have behind the meter batteries. So those batteries could discharge their energy. Okay. They could also consume energy. Now, why is that important? Well, one of the things you can sell to the grid is not just energy, you can sell the ability to regulate frequency. Okay, so the grid's frequency is constantly moving. If demand is slightly outstripping supply, then the frequency will drop. And so the grid is going to send a signal for generators to generate more to prop up frequency. And the opposite is true too. If, for instance, a rainstorm moves into a part of a service territory during a hot day, all of a sudden the load will drop in that area. Then all of a sudden you have a little overgeneration and under demand. And so we need to reduce frequency. So in that case, we need to throttle back on power plants so they're not producing as much. So frequency control is a different product than producing energy.
Right.
Batteries can do frequency control, and they do it extremely quickly and extremely well. So if you have an aggregated group of batteries in your service territory, behind the meters of 10,000 customers, then that's an asset that has a little bit more value than just 30 minutes of energy like you'd have with thermostats. So, okay, that's a slightly different product we have in our store. Things like backup generators that you may have at a number of commercial customers. Well, those diesel generators, they may be permitted to run an extra 100 hours a year because of their air permits or whatnot. And if you have control of those and you can start them up, then now all of a sudden you have 100 hours of this particular asset for however many watts it has. And it can run, it can produce electricity and energy. It might be able to frequency regulation depending on how they're wired in and how they're controlled. But another good thing that those assets offer are reserves, because that's yet another thing you can sell into the market. You can sell responsive reserve, or also what they call spinning reserve, which is any kind of power that you can make available within 10 minutes to help the grid make up for, say, the loss of a large power plant. So you have all these different products you can sell, and you have all these different assets that can produce different products. So the first thing to do is take an inventory and figure out what product is best suited for what portion of the wholesale market. And that is basically, setting up what your inventory of, what your playbook is going to be. And okay, so let's stop it right there. Has that been pretty clear there, Peter? Any comments about that section of this?
No, I would say that is clear. I'd say just keep going.
All right, because the next step is going to be how do you get it to actually run in the market?
Right. I was hoping you'd get to that part. Yes.
Yeah. That's how you make the money, right?
Right.
So most markets are run nowadays using a locational marginal pricing, and it's basically an electronic auction that is run every 5 or 10 minutes, depending on the market. And every asset that can produce power electronically submits what's called an offer curve. That if prices get to this point, I'm willing to give you this many megawatts. And if it moves up to that point, I'll give you this many more megawatts. And if prices go to here, I'll give you that many more megawatts. And it's very simple to do. You just figure out what your marginal cost is. And most companies just bid their marginal cost so that they're deployed when they're in the money and they're not deployed when they're not in the money. Now, there's exceptions to that, like nuclear units. Nuclear units do not throttle up and down very easily. They just want to run at full speed all the time. So they'll usually offer in their electric power at $0, which means they'll just run all the time. And in a lot of grids, nuclear power plants are kind of carved out of the whole auction process. They're going to run all the time no matter what. So it's not important that they participate in the auction. Solar and wind farms, though, they have zero fuel costs, so there's zero marginal cost as well. So they'll usually offer their energy into the market at $0 too, so that no matter what the price is in the market, it's going to be deployed to run. But anything that consumes fuel, like a natural gas or coal plant, is going to calculate what its marginal cost is for producing the next megawatt, and they're going to construct an energy offer curve based on that. Okay, so that's the offer curves that are in the market. Now, companies who need power are going to put it in a bid curve. I'm going to bid, I want 1,000 megawatts if the price is $25. If the price is $15, I want 1,500 megawatts. So as the price goes down, we'll buy more, and as the price goes up, we'll buy less. So you got crossing curves there. The energy offer curve is going up, and the energy bid curves are going down. And anywhere along that line where supply meets demand, those curves cross, that becomes the market clearing price for the entire market. And so everybody who's offered power who's under the market clearing price gets paid the market clearing price, and everybody who's buying power pays the market clearing price. So, and this moves up throughout the day. It's done every 5 minutes electronically. So let's say that we're in this market, and we have a bunch of these demand response and DER resources, and we want to place them into the market using an offer curve that will ensure that they run. But if you only are available for 30 minutes, you want the highest 30-minute prices of the day, I would think, right? So it's kind of like scarcity. If you have if you have a small amount of something, you want to sell it at the very highest price.
Right.
So so you look at we talked earlier about the different categories of stuff. You have your batteries here, you have your thermostat programs there, your industrial DR programs there, and maybe you have some backup generators over there. And you know how many megawatts you have, and you know how many hours they will run. Your most constrained one on any given day is probably going to be your thermostat program. Like I said, it's You get about 30 minutes out of it. Now, you can operate it in a different way. Let's say you have 100 megawatts of thermostats and you hit them all at once, you'll get 30 minutes of power. But if you only hit half of them now and half of them in a half hour, you can probably get 50 megawatts for a whole hour. And you may choose to do that. But the point is, it's probably your smallest inventory of power. So you're going to want to save that for the highest prices. So you create a bid curve, an offer curve for that. And you're looking at the whole year and you think, okay, throughout the year, I think the highest price for the entire year coming up is going to be $3,500. I think I'm only going to be deploying my thermostats for maybe 10 hours for the whole year. So what are the highest priced 10 hours of this coming year? And this is all done based on some sort of a real-time price forecast that you either produce yourself or maybe somebody helps you produce it. But let's just say that that's your price forecast. $3,500 is your highest price. I'm going to be able to sell maybe 10 hours of power off of my thermostats. So I'm going to look at what those highest 10 hours are. And let's say the 10th highest hour is $2,500. So then we know we don't want to deploy our thermostat programs at anything under $2,500. So if prices get $2,500, I'll deploy it. And then when it drops, then at the end of the day, when the day cools off, prices come back down. As soon as it drops below $2,500, we'll release those thermostats to go back and do their business. Okay, so we do it with thermostats. We also do that with your battery program. Now, you may have more capability with battery because it can always be recharged. And so let's say that you expect to use the batteries maybe 100 hours this year. Well, you go back to that price forecast and you look at what are your top 100 prices, 100 hours, and what were those prices? And maybe the 100th hour, the market cleared at let's say $130. Then your offer curve for your battery resources should start at $130. Maybe you deploy half of it at $130 and half at $200. You bid some sort of a curve like that. In any case, you will never deploy your customers' batteries at any price lower than $130 based on your analysis, right? So you have an offer curve in there for your batteries. You put an offer curve together for your customer demand response, the lighting programs, the backup generators. The point is, every one of those individual assets that we analyzed earlier will come up with its own value, its own value picture, its own model, right? And from each of those, you can derive a number above which you want it deployed into the market and a price below which you want to withdraw it. And so each day, your virtual power plant, for its entire capability, will put in one continuous curve that has on the lower part that's supported by the lowest cost or the largest availability, and then in the middle and then the top. So let's say your entire VPP portfolio is 100 megawatts. It's got 20 megawatts of thermostats. It's got 60 megawatts of commercial, so that's 80, and it's got 20 megawatts of battery. You will put all of that as if it's a 100 megawatt asset, and the lower prices that it begins to be deployed will be supported by one set of assets in your VPP. Then as it gets to the middle, the next set on and on. I go into a lot more detail on this in the blog to kind of show how this is done. But the point is that you're presenting to the market a energy offer curve that looks very much like what a power plant would submit. Now, there's a few other things that you're going to have to be able to submit to the market also. The fact that you're only going to be able to do this for 1 hour for a thermostat. So you have to have that registered, and you have to have your offer can only be available for 1 hour. So if it's struck, they have to know that I can only produce at this level for 1 hour, and there are systems for doing that. Similarly, if you have you have to be able to tell you have to tell the market continuously what the state of charge of your battery resources are. So they'll know that whenever this particular aspect of your VPP is being deployed, that it's only available a certain amount of time. Now, I haven't talked about ancillary services, but that's done in essentially the same way. Instead of energy, maybe you're not going to offer your batteries in that energy offer curve. Maybe you put it in ancillary services curve. Same thing. I plan to offer a frequency regulation, but only if the price gets to here. Then above that price, I'll do frequency regulation. And if the price drops below that, I'm not going to do frequency regulation. That's usually done on a day ahead basis so that you know what your commitment is for real time. But and then you can work that into how those batteries can produce energy. So, for instance, we've put our battery resources in day ahead market for frequency regulation. It's been struck from the hours of 12 to 6. In real time, we know we can sell the battery's energy for every other hour except 12 to 6. It has to be held for frequency regulation, and all that works together. All that works together, through the software that controls the VPP and the software that connects to the grid and communicates these capabilities in real time. Okay, that's a lot of information, real quick.
Yes, it is, John.
But the point of it is that you have a large group of hundreds or even thousands of individual resources that are aggregated up, and your control system, your AutoGrid Flex, has put that into a singular consolidated energy offer curve that when it hits the grid sees that and behaves as if that's one power plant, and it gives it exactly the same sort of signals that a power plant would get with no special consideration at all. They're not being penalized, and they're not being incented in any way. It's running just like a power plant. And that's how those assets are run into the market. And then in the next day, whenever it's all over with, it settles with you, and then you get your check for how. And then your VPP system has to figure out how much of that check gets distributed to every one of those customers that participated. And so that's really optimally what a VPP would do. It would aggregate all the capabilities. It would figure out their different value streams in the market. It would enable the operators to configure this energy offer curve I just told you about. And it would automatically deploy that into the market when prices reach the trigger points. And then afterwards, whenever settlements work out, it would figure out how much to pay everybody. It would, calculate exactly how much everybody participated, how much everybody gets paid. So as you can see, that's a very complicated process, and it's an iterative in design. But this is what we're talking about when we talk about the nuts and bolts of how a VPP works.
Right. Excuse me. And that's, what the white paper goes through. So, of course, I think to some people listening to this going, my God, how complicated, I'd rather just fire up this fossil fuel plant, which is some people's perspective. But of course, I think the other thing is there's been such a focus on climate change, even from the investment community. I mean, you didn't used to hear about that a few years ago. Now you're seeing investors saying, hey, this is a risk, we need to decarbonize. And, what you're what you're describing is how the advances in software and artificial intelligence can just manage all of that complexity. The other thing is, like, when people say, how big is your virtual power plant? I'll always say, well, a virtual power plant actually changes every single day, or you could say changes literally in time intervals. You have like your total pool, like you described, of assets, but on any given day, it could be 20 megawatts, 50 megawatts. And within that, the mixture of all those small little DERs could also vary depending on availability. People also say there's some fatigue. I think you even addressed this with demand response. Like if you call too many demand response events, let's say in March and April, you might not get as much of a response later in the year. Or, I mean, that's kind of like, that's where there's some uncertainty. And that's why you're also like always hedging your bets with all these different resources. Like you're saying, you're putting in these different offers, you're calculating all this sort of like multidimensional, I guess is the way to think about it. And it sounds like mind-boggling, but it actually happens. That's what's amazing about it, is that it's happening.
If it was easy, we'd have been doing this all along. It's not easy. And we just didn't have the communications and control infrastructure available to us that we do. and regulatory incentives. And plus, VPPs in general make a lot of sense from a lot of angles. You mentioned the environmental aspects. Like I mentioned, whenever a demand response product is something that we're not producing power or we're not consuming power, and the cleanest megawatt is always the one that's never produced.
Right.
But and things like batteries, they can charge at night whenever there's more renewable energy and deploy during the day. Backup generators are part of some VPPs, and those consume diesel. So these things are not entirely clean, but they do represent a option that it would be cleaner than an alternative, which would be a 40-year-old steam plant with a 12 heat rate that's kicking on, right?
Right.
Another important value of a virtual power plant and distributed energy mechanism like this as well to the utility company is the fact that almost all of these assets are actually purchased by the customer. So
Right.
you don't have the utilities capital tied up in those. If we want to build a power plant, we got to come up with $1 billion to build this thing. We got to finance it, and we got to take the debt service of that and pass it through to our customers for the next 30 years. And we have to have the cost of capital on top of that to charge through. So this is something. So big power plants and big investments like that provide, put a drain on a utilities debt and their ability to run their organization from a financial point of view. But if you can all of a sudden add a 200 megawatt power plant to your portfolio and you haven't dropped a cent of capital into it, that's a pretty good deal for you and for your customers, right?
Yeah.
Your customers already made that investment for a purpose, right? They've already bought some backup power because they're prone to hurricanes or something like that. But that backup battery or whatever it is may not run but 3 hours a year. And wouldn't they like to get some benefit out of it the other 8,757 hours, right? So
Right.
that's another point about VPPs that they make a lot of sense. They are in generally a low or no carbon alternative.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the other argument is sort of some people call it the democratization of the energy system because you're having, we call them prosumers. We haven't used that word yet, but this idea that you're not just a passive consumer with a one-way relationship from the utility, you also can produce or reduce your demand. And yeah, these assets have already been paid for. And the other term we haven't used yet is the bidirectional nature. So yeah, I'm actually trying to get a solar battery system installed. It's a long story. I have some HOA issues, which now I'm dealing with the practical realities of what a
Yeah, right.
customer has to deal with. But I will then theoretically become part of a VPP that AutoGrid Flex software is used with a community choice aggregation program. We don't have to go into that in California, where it's actually would be with Sonoma Clean Power. So I'm very excited at hopefully within the next few months, that's all going to happen. So that's, the beauty of this VPP is, I could have resiliency from my battery, but the power really doesn't go out that often. So, I can be contributing to grid reliability, when it's needed. So,
Right,
um,
right. And you
yeah,
might make a little paycheck.
right.
Once a
Yeah,
few times a year, you might get a little paycheck that helps defray some of your upfront costs.
right. Now, of course, what we haven't, of course, this is all dependent on actually having a market, and that's where each region might have a slightly different market. You mentioned 5 minute intervals, and I know that's kind of where the trend. I know Australia has moved to a five market, and since that time, the trading can be frenzied, so in some ways it's like a market on steroids. Someone once described it, but other regions, some regions, I don't know, you would know better than I, in the U.S. might still just have a 30-minute a settlement period or something. I know they used to have that in BPA up in the Pacific Northwest. I don't know if they've modified that, but you know, that's where the regional market structures will shape your specific strategy
That's
for
exactly right.
some of these assets.
That's exactly
Exactly.
right. You kind of have to sort of analyze where you are geographically and what the market offers. There's also another aspect to this. Some areas have retail competition and some areas don't.
Right.
In an area with retail competition, like a lot of Texas, you can aggregate customers across like the whole state. So
Right.
you might have a virtual power plant that consists of customers in Houston, in Dallas, in San Angelo, in Corpus Christi, all the way down to Laredo. So this is able to be done. I mean, you can actually produce power all over the country, but it's all aggregated through a single point of contact with your company wherever you're located, and that's the order that goes back and forth with ERCOT. So think of this. And this has become a little talking point among the aggregated DER community here. Let's say, and Texas is prone to transmission congestion. So let's say that prices get to a certain point, and you've deployed your VPP, and a lot of your assets are somewhere on the wrong side of the congestion, right? So if they actually deploy, it's going to make congestion worse. How do you mitigate against that? So special pricing zones are being looked at, such that, because every generator has its own price in a locational marginal pricing market like ERCOT, but loads are generally by the zone, right? And so you would get, generally, if you had a load that was consuming less power, it would get paid for what it didn't consume, but it would be paid at a load zone price. Now that might wind up, and so if you're paid by that price, it may incent you to go ahead and deploy your VPP. But the actual physical location that deployment happens may be in an area that actually aggravates congestion on the transmission side. So there's some technical work that has to be done with how to price out specific areas for purposes of load that's participating in the market. So that's another real complicated thing that's having to be worked through.
Right.
But
Yeah.
another thing I wanted to bring up is that uh, uh, let's say you want to set up a virtual power plant, but you're inside of a non-opt-in area, an area
Right.
that's maybe a utility, like a municipal utility or a co-op. That might be a little bit more difficult to do, because those areas, especially, I'm talking about Texas now, the reason those areas are set up is because the utility company is owned by the customers, either in
Right.
a co-op situation or a municipal, it's owned by the city. So what the market has granted you a service territory, and you are the sole monopoly. You're the monopoly provider of power for that territory. Now, in a because you have that, you cannot sell to any other retail customers anywhere else in Texas. You can only sell to your retail customers in your certificated territory, and nobody else can sell to the customers in your territory.
Right.
Only you can provide them the power. So if another company came into a municipal or co-op and decided to set up a VPP and operate it, it would be like another power company selling power to their certificated area. And so that puts in danger the franchise that is given that area. Okay. So many of those companies have put in policies such that, yeah, we can run a VPP in this area, but you have to run it through our company. Our
Right.
company has to actually run it. And so, because we can't have another company selling to our customers, it violates our franchise. So it's a little bit more complicated, but and different munis and co-ops are in different areas on the horizon, on the spectrum, and some of them have very specific delineated rules that, yeah, you can come play, but this is what you have to do. Every megawatt you produce has to be sold to the utility. We have these prices all set out. We want to encourage innovation, and some of them don't have anything set out, any kind of process set out. And so that kind of leads to a differentiation in how AutoGrid wants to provide the service. Okay, and maybe now we can talk about the different kinds of VPP structures that AutoGrid has. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I had a few issues I wanted to touch upon, so I want to touch upon that, and just so you know what else I have on
Okay.
my question list as we go forward. The other one is one issue that came to mind as you talked about, all this diversity of DERs and stuff, but someone might say, yeah, but you have all these different manufacturers of all these different things. Like, how does that aspect work? And then the last one is more this idea of, we talked about VPPs. Then there's the concept of DERMS, distributed energy resource management, which AutoGrid's Flex can also do, but deals more with the sort of physics of the grid. So, here's an asset on the distribution level, you're selling part of it in the wholesale level, but would that ever impact the distribution level? And how does that, how do the controls? And we might not get to that, but why don't you go to turnkey, or if you want to tackle the diverse manufacturer sort of
Yeah, let's talk
issue.
about that real quick. Yeah, because we talked about all those different kinds of capabilities.
Yes,
You know, just in thermostats, there's probably a dozen different kinds of smart thermostats.
right.
And so your VPP is going to have to interface with all of those thermostats. It's going to have to communicate with them. Many of those smart thermostats, can be Wi-Fi connected, and so
Hmm.
you'll need some sort of a Wi-Fi connection between your thermostat, not just the owner's phone, but also the power company. So you
Right.
have to have an interface between the VPP at the power company and that particular thermostat. And so AutoGrid has worked with all of the different vendors to create automated programming interfaces such that they can interface with APIs. They can talk to any of those and give them commands to move however many degrees, to withdraw that command, and to actually meter the amount of energy that was saved. Okay, what about building management systems? There's those, a lot of those are customized, but there are a few major vendors that produce energy management systems. Hotels and whatnot usually have an energy management system. There's several handfuls of providers for those, and and AutoGrid has created interfaces with all of those as well. There are solar and battery systems for homes that can use the solar to charge the batteries or use the solar to run the house, depending on prices in the market and the customer's plan. AutoGrid has interfaces and business agreements with many of those as well. And so by systematically moving through all of the assets that are available in the market, AutoGrid has invested years and a lot of time in creating interfaces that work with those softwares. In fact, it's actually a win-win, because that manufacturer wants the system that they sell to the customer to be as flexible as possible and to bring as much value to the customer. Therefore, if the system they sell to you, Peter, can also be tapped into by AutoGrid to run your system as part of the VPP, then you want that. And so they've found a lot of willing partners, technology partners, and you start with the biggest and you move down to the different regional areas and things like this. But to date, I don't even know how many interfaces they have in business.
No,
Is it?
no, it keeps growing, and of course, the one thing, it's also EVs, I believe, and that's sort of like a hot topic here in general, is then the use of EV chargers and growth in EVs as a grid resource, managed charging, or even tapping the batteries in emergencies. And I believe AutoGrid has more EVs that it can connect with than any other firm. And that's obviously that's kind of the latest DER resource that a lot of people are talking about. But let's get back to your other thing you wanted to talk about. Let's really talk about this concept of the turnkey VPP, which is also very recent. That's sort of I think that's within the last year. I mean, I hadn't heard that phrase, and of course, since I've been with AutoGrid, that's kind of like one of our latest, most exciting developments.
For sure. So AutoGrid is very flexible in how it can assist a customer. So you might have a utility that already has all of the demand side assets identified and connected, and they're controlling them through programs that maybe they built, or programs that a third party built. But they are very engaged with their customers, and they have a good infrastructure. They have a control room, and they just need somebody to organize all of that. So in that case, AutoGrid can come in with their offering called software as a service, where they customize and provide the control software so that your utility, that overlays the existing systems to allow you to optimize all of these resources in the market. Doing all those things that I said earlier that it can do. That was the situation I was in my former employer, when we had a number of very active programs, but we just needed to get it organized. And AutoGrid moved in with their terrific system. And I personally used that system for many years, which is one of the reasons after I retired, I wanted to go ahead and continue advocate for AutoGrid and their ability to get this capability in. But that's the software as a service. It means you already got control. You were all set up to go, and you just want to use that software to help organize your existing processes. But there's a whole much larger subset of utilities where there's little or they understand that they have some demand response, so they may have some customers on a curtailable rate. They are getting a growing number of customers who are getting assets behind the meter, and they're looking, are there any special programs for this? Well, their turnkey system is they bring in managers and directors and customer service folks to help design programs for that particular utility. Within its rate structure or its price structure or whatever, it will say, okay, we need to put together a program for thermostat control, for battery control, and everything. We need to work with you to figure out what are going to be incentives, or what kind of contracts we're going to have with those customers. Do contracts need to be changed? Do we need to get new tariffs passed? We need to put all of that infrastructure together to organize all of those assets such that they can be linked together and they can be interfaced with the central control system. And then the control system is brought in and programmed and customized, and the people at the utility are understanding it. And then we can go from one of two ways from there. Maybe the utility itself actually operates the system itself for its benefit, or AutoGrid can even move in as a partner participant, operate, deploy, and settle all of those assets as if it is a power plant under the control of that utility. So there's a couple of different ways VPP can, the turnkey system can work. One of them is that we set the whole program up and you operate it, or we set the whole program up and we operate it as if we're a power plant that you have contracted to run. All of those are possibilities, and all of those things have been, deployed in one shape or another under the AutoGrid umbrella. So okay, so we have from one end to the other. We have the software as a service all the way to the VPP, all the way to the turnkey system, and everything in between. They're staffed by some of the smartest people in the whole business and have a lot of experience with a lot of different utility companies. So that's kind of that's kind of the process by which a company who wanted to participate in this VPP new world would go about it if AutoGrid was a partner. You have a lot of different options, a lot of different expertise they bring to the table.
Yeah, and it's even broader than that. But obviously, we've been focusing on VPPs. I mentioned just briefly DERMS, which again, which we haven't mentioned yet, that Schneider Electric, of course, has recently acquired AutoGrid, and so now you don't have just the software of AutoGrid. You also have some technology from Schneider Electric, more the what they call the ADMS systems, and then DERMS, which is dealing kind of more with the physics of the grid at the distribution level, as we've been saying. So you've got to have, you got to be aware of the fact that if you're selling into wholesale markets, there could be an impact at that distribution level. But the beauty of it is that you have a software platform that can do that. And then on top of that, we haven't talked about a topic dear to me, microgrids, which is yet another form of DER management, more about resiliency and islanding. So really, you kind of cover the full DER spectrum, starting with DR, basic DR as we described. That's kind of where all of this started. DR, DERs, VPPs, DERMS,
ADR.
yes, that's true. Yeah. So the acronyms keep piling up. But what they all have in common is this idea of squeezing more value out of assets often paid for by someone besides the utility, although they could be even utility assets. We should admit that it doesn't have to be non-utility assets. There could be utility assets. And it could be, are you a regulated utility, a deregulated utility? Are you a municipal utility? Are you a co-op? No matter what, there is some way to squeeze more value out of DERs, and that's what AutoGrid is doing. And now with the combo with Schneider Electric, it's just opening up more doors. But I don't know, we're kind of coming here to a conclusion, I guess, of our conversation. We covered a lot of ground, John, and there is more detail in this white paper, which can be downloaded. But any final thoughts or you want to share with us as we wrap up this podcast?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this is one of the most exciting areas to work in the energy industry. I mean, for the longest time, the industry was just we have more customers, economic growth. We need more power. Let's build more power plants. It had one play basically. Now there's a lot of different plays, and the fact that it's complex is what makes it compelling. It brings more thought to the table, and it brings bright companies like AutoGrid to the table, and it stimulates the excitement in what a lot of people have thought was an old and kind of boring industry. I mean, the electric power industry touches everybody in the country, everybody in the world, and these sorts of innovations are a way to kind of get a next generation of thinkers and engineers and scientists and programmers involved in sort of building, kind of a new infrastructure and the new energy. I call it the future energy landscape. And it's going to be quite different from the old one. It's going to have a lot of the previous elements, but it's going to be quite different from the old one. And the also the incentive of climate change and the need to kind of reduce carbon emissions because of that. Just brings a lot of challenge and interest and excitement to the field. And AutoGrid has a number of young programmers in there that are just so incredibly bright and committed, and I see that all over the place. I see more young faces going to industry conferences and getting involved in this. So I just wanted to make a plug for that, as this is kind of turning our boring old industry into sexy new high tech, and it's very gratifying to see. And it leaves me kind of hopeful that we're going to be able to crack this, and without sacrificing our standard of living and continued economic growth as a country. So that's
Yeah,
really the point that I wanted to make at the end here.
yeah, no, and I just want to remind that we are talking about this white paper, unlocking new value streams with multi-asset VPPs. And one follow-on to your comment, I remember I have written several energy books, and I remember, when you're a writer, I used to go to writers' conference. People say, "Oh, what do you write about?" And I'd go, "Energy." Like 30 years ago, they go, why would you want to write about energy? But then, while being in California, we had the big power outages in like 2000, 2001, where then, people, that was sort of, for me personally, when people started going, oh, wow, why is the power going out? And then wind was kind of coming on, and people, I mean, it was still controversial in some ways, but you're right. The energy industry is a lot more exciting. There's the crossover with telecom and IT, and of course, there's been so much innovation there. And now there's even crossover to transportation, the electric vehicles. So I think people are realizing how interconnected, thanks to new technologies like the softwares and the decarbonization trend, which originally was viewed as like, oh, that's going to raise costs, and in some cases could. But on the other hand, there are solar has come down so much. I remember when I started here, people would say solar's great, but it's the most expensive resource out there. That's what was standard like 40 years ago when you would hear about it. Now it's like, the cost keeps coming down and the batteries keep coming down. So it is an exciting field, and it's also, for me, a field where you feel like you're part of this new business, but you're also helping the economy, helping the environment, and even equity issues and stuff we haven't gotten into. But there's a lot. It touches everything, and it's so exciting to be part of that. And of course, others will follow. Where I do feel a little old sometimes when I talk to these young programmers. I'm just like, glad you're figuring that all out, because that's beyond me. But we're all part of the solution. That's the beauty of the VPP, I guess.
That's exactly right.
So, all right. Thanks, John.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for asking me to be on the podcast. Let's do it again.
All right. Sounds good.